Hello. Yeah, so today we've been called to discuss whether or not Mary Barnett is guilty uh, of the death of her child because she traveled out of state without providing proper care, or taking the safety of her child into consideration. Well, as we saw from the testimonies of the prosecutors. Uh, and the first one was in the person of her neighbor, Carolyn Hoppers, um, who appeared to have a little history of the defendant, Miss Barnett. And she told us a story of um, how she partied in her apartment and you know, had traveled out of state uh, without, considering the safety of her infant child, you know. And in short, she gave an impression that Miss Mary Barnett was a very irresponsible person and not fit to be a mom. And the second uh, testimony was from the officer at the scene of crime, uh, you know, in the person of Officer Michelle. And Michelle gave factual, testimony of, you know, uh, his findings at the scene. A baby had died, and when he tried to investigate the cause of the death, uh, Miss Barnett initially explained that she had put the baby under the care and custody of a babysitter, but in the process of his investigation, discovered that that was not true. Okay, so the officer gave factual testimony of his findings at the crime scene. Then the third testimony was from the uh, prosecution, um, the psychiatrist for the prosecution, and in his own case, he gave an impression that Mary was, capable of uh, undergoing trial, that she was in a very stable mental condition, and that Mary should be, punished, for exposing her child to such uh, grave danger that eventually took the life of the baby. Well, uh, going by all the testimonies of the prosecution, my mind was made up that Mary should be, you know, uh, found guilty. But as I listened to the side of the defendant, I begin to, rethink my position. See, well, to prove uh, to prove a case of second degree murder, there must be an intent. There must be um, the person must be conscious of the consequence, and must be conscious of what they are doing. Okay, so as we see from the testimony of the defendant, the first one being Miss Mary's neighbor, Miss Alice Jones. She kind of gave a human face to the personality of Mary. She specifically explained to us that she had known Mary for 8 years, which was a long period of time, and that Mary had slipped into postpartum depression, after giving birth to a child. This is very logical. It's an evidence based, fact that women uh, can actually come down with postpartum depression after giving birth to a baby. And she further explained to us that Her fiance had left her, traveled out of state, leaving her by herself to cater for the baby. See, so under the condition of her mental illness, she was faced with the stress of having to care for her baby by herself, and I guess she tried to you know um, take care of the situation herself, which was not possible, you know, and resorted to alcohol intake. And Mr. Jones also explained to us that her wedding, Miss Barnett's wedding, was called off. You see, so in my view, I see that as the last straw that broke the camel's back, and Miss Barnett just like lost touch of reality, wasn't thinking right, and traveled out of state. And, we all know what happened afterwards. And of course, Miss Mary's psychologist came along, Dr. Bloom, and explained to us that Mary had two panic attacks. Has had two panic attacks at the point she was hospitalized and had a near catatonic, situation. She was hospitalized for days, so. And he was able to diagnose that Mary was mentally ill, and that made a whole lot of sense. Okay, so in conclusion, Mary, we had to prove that Mary, had an intent to kill the baby, and this was not the case because Mary was mentally sick. There's no way a mentally ill person can have an intent, to do something. You see, so she was down with postpartum depression, which could be very severe in some cases. And I would not be surprised if the case of Mary was a very severe one. Okay, so she had postpartum depression, which meant she had a mental illness that needed to be treated. And, she tried to address the issue herself from her possible lack of knowledge and, resorted to alcohol intake. That did not help her. And, the second point to prove that she was she should be held guilty for her offense was the fact that she was conscious of what she was doing. In my view and from the evidence of the prosecution and defendant, it doesn't appear that she was conscious. She like just went south, from the depression to taking alcohol to eventually, learning that her her husband was transferred, out of state, and eventually learned that her wedding had been put off, and she was led, by herself, and that like made her lose touch with reality. Yeah, that's a human nature, I believe, could have happened, and she traveled without considering that, she was putting her baby in danger. And last point to prove that she was guilty would be that she was conscious of the consequence of her action. I don't believe someone who is mentally ill could be conscious of their action. See, Miss Bennett had postpartum depression. She was ill. It's very evident, and there's no way she could have been conscious of her action. And with all these, facts, I believe Miss Mary is not guilty of the offense of second-degree murder of her baby, and she should not be incarcerated, but rather she should be treated for the sickness because she's mentally unstable, mentally ill. Thank you.